that we want you to think. So, all right, Danny, welcome again, everyone, as we continue our series on the church and politics and our discussions really on race and race-related things there. Yeah. So, Danny, thanks again for being with us. We got a great guest today. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
I am too. I am very much looking forward to it. And just want to remind all our listeners, we never expect everyone to agree with everything we say. In fact, we encourage critical thought. Our whole purpose in this, when bringing the guests on that we do, is to challenge us to think and not just default to biases or ideas or streams of thought that we've always had, but to actually think these through prayerfully about what our response and responsibility as followers of Jesus are. So anyway, that's kind of our encouragement to you as we get into today's show.
All right. Well, I'm going to bring on our guest. We are privileged to have Jeff Liou. Reverend Jeff is the National Director of Theological Formation for InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, USA. He's also an affiliate associate professor of Christian ethics at Fuller Theological Seminary in Pasadena, where he received his PhD in theology and culture. Jeff has written on race and justice, Asian American Christianity, theological ethics, and political theology. He's ordained in the Christian Reformed Church of North America, and he served as a campus pastor, university chaplain, a minister. And all of his views, he says here, are his own and do not represent his employer. I think Danny and I are saying that as well. Yeah. So, Jeff, welcome. Thank you so much for being with us today.
It's a privilege to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, we're glad. So take a few moments, Jeff, and just tell us a little bit about yourself and what it is you do now. Can you describe that for us?
Sure. Yeah. Child of immigrants. My parents immigrated from Taiwan in the 70s. My father was a surgeon and a general practitioner. I thought I would be one as well, but the Lord called me to ministry when I was in college at the University of Michigan, which is also where I met the woman who would become my wife, Lisa. And we've been married for 22 years. And we now live in Southern California, where I have 2 kids. One teenager who just went away to college, she's 18, and then one high schooler who's 15 and enjoys basketball. So that's my life. What I do now, I am the director of theological formation, which means that I develop and deliver foundational theological training for all the staff of InterVarsity who are on the ground doing work with students and faculty.
Great. Wonderful. I mentioned to you before we started, Jeff, that the CRT is one of the issues that has just been, why does everyone hate it? What does it mean? It's just, whatever it is, it's bad. And it's like, it doesn't sound bad. So we really appreciate you coming on with us. You've written a wonderful book I put up on the top of the screen on CRT and Christianity. And I really appreciate it. So one of the problems that, for people like myself, like white folks, right, is I'm coming to learn is the pervasiveness of racial prejudice. I just simply didn't know it. Danny and I talked about this a little bit on some live streams that we did recently. Can you help us understand kind of the pervasiveness of racial discrimination? Because as a white person, I don't see it as often, obviously, as you experience it. And then even give us some of your own experiences so that we just might help understand a little bit better what you're really talking about, what's really going on.
Sure. Let me do my best here. Okay.
Please.
And in my process of describing it, I'm going to try to shift kind of the way that your listeners and viewers imagine this social challenge, right? Because when we say racial discrimination, one of the things that we're implying is that this is something that happens between people. Right. So I want to make that a little bit more complex. So I'll describe 4 different angles through which we can look at this. So the first angle is things a person may experience. The CDC recently reported that 57% of Asian American high school students say they experience negative mistreatment by race.
Wow.
49% of Black students, 45% of multiracial students, compared to 17% of white students. Now, when you see a report like that, the angle that you're looking at is things a person may experience. So that's one angle, right? The numbers aren't good. So pervasiveness, it's pretty high. But the second angle is things that happen that are entirely personal. So you can see the distinction between things I experience and things that I do to someone else. So for example, growing up in Oklahoma, our church was spray painted with a swastika and we were told to die, right? So that's something entirely personal. During COVID, anti-Asian graffiti was spray painted here in the Pasadena area where I live. getting attacked online, physical violence against Asian American elders that we saw during COVID. These things are entirely personal. So that's a second angle. A third angle is things that happen that we don't think they're personal. We think it's just business. So an example, which is where CRT was really born, was legal studies, the law.
Yeah.
Is the law, does it have different impacts upon people? Maybe it's not personal, like tax law doesn't seem particularly personal. It seems like just ordinary business, but the unequal outcomes are what CRT really focuses on. And then the fourth angle is that things that we don't think are personal, like we didn't mean anything by it, but it just represents our biases or maybe our common sense that we had inherited from our ancestors or from our family, right? So I'll give you an example. 20 years ago, this landmark study on name-based discrimination in employment. Right? You remember this, like black sounding names were way less likely to receive a callback. Now, if you're viewing this, what do you think about 2024? You think we've made progress? Well, Berkeley and UCLA did a study, and it's not that much better, right? Between 9% and 24% of from company to company called black sounding names back less. So pervasiveness and also, intractability, it's just been there for a long time.
Let me just jump in real quick. Before we go any further, we've all thrown around the term CRT, which stands for critical race theory. Right. For those who haven't perhaps engaged with that yet. I think we one of the things we, again, as white male leaders, and Rob and I obviously fall in that category, there's a limited, if we're not careful, there's a very limited cultural lens, and it doesn't allow us to see that non-whites still perceive the institutions of Christianity in America as being sort of the property or the control of white people. That's a quote from that. And I think we both experienced that. Can you elaborate on that for us a little bit?
Yeah. Okay. So this is one of those sentences. I'm glad you picked this one out. It can kind of stick in the throat a little bit. It sounds like what we're saying is that the church belongs to whites. And what we're really saying is that sometimes when non-whites walk into a space, a church, or an institution, it doesn't feel like it's for us. I'll give you a couple examples. So again, let me use the categories that I try to set up, the angles. Things that aren't personal, right? You walk into a church, there's things that we do because we've always done them that way. So one example is in our denomination, we have welcomed congregations that speak primarily Spanish or Korean or Chinese, but our denominational local gatherings are in English, and we don't have the personnel to do translation. So that's not personal, is it?
Right.
But it can send a message that, okay, we don't have anything to help you. The same is true for, your church culture norms, even the theology that you espouse. The worship music certainly has something to do with it. It's still relatively rare for a church leader to be tuned into the people who aren't a part of the big bell curve, right? The people on the sides of the bell curve. And that makes sense. They want to target as many people as they can.
Yeah.
Right? But such a utilitarian ministry philosophy, as well-intended as it may be, it leaves out the one sheep as a rule.
I had a session meeting with our elders at the church one time, and I said, I put a bunch of magazines I had just picked up from wherever on the table. I said, I want you to pick out pictures of what you want the church to look like, or what you think of the church. Yeah. And they picked out all these pictures, and I think this is like 7-8 years ago. Someone put up a picture of Vladimir Putin, and they said, so I said, okay, now why'd you pick that picture? Because we want to be a church for everyone. And I said, okay. I said, great, but do you realize that when you do this, you're telling these people that they're not welcome? When you do this, you're telling these people that they're not welcome. When we don't consciously, we say we want to be a church for everyone, but we really actually want to be a church for people like ourselves. Sure. And that's what happens there. So now, do you find that some people, like whites in particular, and we're not going to pick on whites, but we're just simply, that's the dominant theme here, that they respond by overreacting, by saying, oh, that you're overreacting, by saying, your experiences, maybe they weren't legitimately racially motivated. How do you respond to that kind of of claim, accusation?
Sure. I mean, I've gotten that so many times. I can't even
Okay.
count. And it's not just from white folks. So I'll explain. So, one of my colleagues, when I was working in the church, I was kind of entrusting to them the pain that I was experiencing, and they said to me, "It can't be that bad." And it's well intended.
Yeah.
I could say that in a way that's intended to be comforting, but it's also invalidating, right?
Yeah. Right. Exactly.
One of our church members very vehemently slammed his fist on the table during a conversation about race, and he said that what people of color are complaining about is just "quote unquote" hurt feelings. So that's totally invalidating, right? In a pretty forceful way. But then there's other folks like, my dad lived through kidnappings in Taiwan, political kidnappings. So what I experience from day to day, I could understand if he said, well, sure, you have some pain, but I survived this.
Toughen up.
Yeah. One person that I was in small group with lived through lynchings in the Deep South.
Yeah.
So I can understand if they think that, the word overreacting can be invalidating. But as a pastor, when someone comes to me in clear distress, I don't ask them first if they're misperceiving reality, if they're overreacting, right? As a person of color, in terms of my experience, the effect of being questioned over and over again is to begin to question my grasp of reality. Am I crazy? And that actually has deleterious effects on my personal health, when I cite a statistic like 57% of Asian American high school students experience racism, to question all of them as hurt feelings, it's just not going to help them. So it's not the best way forward.
Okay.
So maybe the next thing we should do is just stop for a minute and have you give us a definition of CRT and just sort of explain it, maybe some variations on it. Because I think as Rob and I both experienced, it's now CRT and DEI are they're triggers that people just immediately eject and say, oh, and then you throw the word woke on top of it. and the whole little constellation of terms becomes a place where people just dismiss what you're thinking about, any argument about it, because these now have become sort of codified into this negative perception by a huge portion of our population. And of course, in the political arena, they've just been thrown out there left, right, and center. So could you help us understand what CRT is a little bit and some of the variations of it?
Yeah. Very astute observation there about our political discourse. In fact, there was a conservative political strategist who said exactly what you just explained. We're going to take CRT as a term. We're going to load it with everything that we hate, and we're going to push it back out so that anytime the word comes up, it just triggers that kind of reaction. So very successful strategy. But our book is intended to tell the truth about what CRT is. It originates in legal studies. In the late 60s, early 70s is the origins. So right on the heels of the civil rights movement. And the questions that they were asking were things like, we just won all of these incredible Supreme Court cases and advances for civil rights. Why aren't we seeing legal reforms happen the way we expected them to because the Supreme Court made these decisions? So the legal scholars and activists engage in scrutiny of the legal code, the law, and they decided there's still something baked into the way we do things, our founding documents, that prohibit us from seeing the kind of, if I could explain it, is zooming in versus zooming out. Our abstract thinking keeps us zoomed out, and we make policies from this 30,000 foot level. But what CRT is asking us to do is to zoom in into the experience of people of color and make policies by being informed by these disparate experiences of living in the United States. That's essentially what CRT is asking us to do.
Okay. So, well, go ahead. So I think Danny wanted a follow up there. Are there variations of CRT, and can you kind of give us a snapshot of what they are?
Yeah, sure. So, Danny, did you want to follow up on that?
I was going to say, and particularly, you guys make some different. Eventually, I'd like for you to sort of do some value judgments of those different aspects, because one of your positions in the book is there's some things that CRT is very valuable, and some things for a believer and for the church, and other things maybe we should. Right. I think we're going to get to that later, but I think as you talk about all these things.
Sure. So the variations. So there's the stuff that comes right out of legal studies. So we're talking late 60s, early 70s. There are derivatives of CRT, so applications of CRT in different fields. So for example, CRT in education. I'll give you an example. One of the theorists talks about how when educators look at a child and they say, this child is missing this, this, and this, that's called deficit thinking. They're missing this, this, and this. Sometimes those deficits are, basically deemed to be cultural. So cultural deficits. What happens when you do that is you tend to miss cultural assets. So just because I can't recognize that someone's capable of X, Y, and Z doesn't mean, that
Right.
my standards of what constitutes a deficit or an asset should be applied. So that's a derivative of CRT from legal studies. Then there's, of course, the culture war version of CRT, which we've talked about. That's the kind where you load the term with all kinds of meaningless kind of things that we hate. And that one, I think, should be soundly labeled as misinformation or untruth.
So when they talk about like CRT in the classroom, because I think that's one of the big issues, right? Is that we got to get out of the classroom. We can't have it in the classroom. And tell me if I'm wrong here, but I think one of the states was like, we don't want our students to feel bad about themselves or something along those lines.
Yep.
What specific aspect of CRT or are they discussing then?
Sure. I think in my estimation, I think it's the culture war version.
Okay.
Because when you look at the phenomena and what they're actually doing with these school board policies or even legislation at the state level, it alters curricula to make sure they exclude histories of people of color, the stories of activists who worked for racial justice. So it narrows the approved story that we tell students about what the United States is. And, for example, most recently, like, the state of Oklahoma, my home state, had to kind of walk back its requisition for Bibles that they now mandate to be in the classroom. Because initially, those Bibles had to include the U.S. Constitution and, the kind of nationalist kind of agenda had to be walked back. So these are the kinds of things I'm thinking about.
Okay. All right. So one of the things I found that the arguments that I've seen before, but your book does a good job of bringing it out, is that racism is built into the American system. So let me give you some examples, some quotes from your book. You said between 1790 and 1952, naturalization of as a U.S. citizen was limited to those legally defined as white. The Expatriation Act of 1907 stripped white women of their U.S. citizenship as a consequence of marriage to an immigrant husband. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, social and legal category of white was officially the structure of the United States. The stakes were high, you add. You were considered white by law, then you and your family received all the best socioeconomic and political benefits that the United States had to offer. You could live where you wanted or be hired in any job. This is like, for a white man like me, it's like, what are you talking about? Everyone has this right. So that's where I'm going, right? Your kids could go to the best schools, universities, or swim in the local pool any day of the week, except for the day reserved for Blacks and Latinos. I'm like, what? Okay. You would not be turned down for any local hospital. You could eat at any restaurant in town. You could sit in any movie theater seat or church pew. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which for the first time in U.S. history barred an entire ethnic group from immigration. Racism towards Italians and Eastern Europeans fueled the passage of the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, the Cable Act of 1922, and the Immigration Act of 1924. So this is baked into the American system.
I mean, we use the legal system to justify these things. And this is where my co-author, Robert Chow Romero, who is also an attorney, as well as a ethnic studies professor at UCLA, this is where his chapter is just really, really strong. Just
right.
The receipts are there. The machinery of the legal system allows clever attorneys and legislators to use it to their advantage and to the detriment of people of color. Historically speaking, that's how it's been used.
So this has all kinds of repercussions for people of color on like everyday life.
I agree.
Okay. Wow.
Yeah. And I think, we there's so many so many trails we could go down on this.
Yeah.
But, for instance, you guys note about one of the big disparities is in things like median household income. 2019, median Black household earned only 61 cents for every dollar of income by the median white. For median whites, Hispanics earned 74 cents on the dollar. So there was a income disparity in these ethnic groups, racial groups. The number of kids living in poverty is higher in these marginalized groups, et cetera. There's all these evidences for food insecurity, for housing insecurity, for all of these things. It seems to suggest, these statistics, that it's far more entrenched than we normally assume it to be.
I think that's right, Danny. I think the way that we've wanted so badly to talk about progress has ended up masking the realities that are right there on the surface of the persistence of inequality. And again, CRT, we're not really talking. This entire conversation so far has not really focused on my bad intentions towards someone or someone's bad intentions toward me. It's been focused on the unequal outcomes, the impacts of what we consider to be an impersonal system. So that's why it's so much more entrenched than we might think. It's because the way the system works is our common sense. Why would we do it any other way? In fact, to suggest that we alter the system may seem so radical or quote unquote Marxist or liberal or whatever term that you want to use that resists the kind of change that could possibly benefit communities of color.
Yeah.
So the list of things that I gave before, right, in the previous question was 1921, 1922, 1882. And the ones that Danny just listed were 2019, 2020, right? I know it's the impact is still being felt in communities of color.
Yes, that's right. And some folks are arguing, and I think I agree with them, that it's because of the way we continue to structure our world. That in order for some people to be at the top, it requires that there are some people who are marginalized at the bottom and their marginalization is profitable for people at the top. That's a really insidious and kind of ugly story. To tell ourselves that that's the story, I can see why schools would want to keep that from making students feel bad, because people at that kind of concrete operational stage of development, they're like, well, am I the bad one? And that's clearly an oversimplification, which is why we don't teach CRT in the schools. It's just,
right.
It's a legal scholarship thing. It's in law school. It's in college sometimes, but anyway.
So the goal then of CRT at that level is to simply bring awareness to the issue so that we can begin to make change.
I think that's fair, and I'm not sure what you mean by at that level, but I think at the
academic level, at the schools.
I do think at the academic level, from college on up, CRT and critical race theorists, they do have an agenda. It's not like some neutral. It's not just some neutral observation. What they have in mind is equality, equity for communities of color to whom it's been denied. Right. So that can be deemed a progressive kind of orientation. But, really, I that's why we argue theologically that because biblical justice and righteousness lifts up the foreigner, right, and cares for the margins, that this stuff is not so far-fetched to look there intentionally and to factor in the different experiences of folks like they do in the distribution of food. Right, in Acts with Stephen, to deliberately look at the differences that give rise to inequality, that's not new.
Yeah, I mean, if I can insert just for a second, that one of the reasons why Danny and I are doing this in a long series we started in March on the church and politics is to say that when we go to the polls, it's one opportunity that we have as Christians to love our neighbor as ourselves. All the election stuff that's happening, you're getting probably like me 10 text messages a day or more, all the commercials on television, they're all appealing to ourselves, to us. You don't want higher taxes, therefore don't vote for this person. You don't want these nasty immigrants to come in, therefore don't vote for this person. You don't want this, therefore don't. And it's almost all negative, right? Don't vote for this person because they're going to do all these bad things for you. And that's the antithesis of the gospel, right? As a Christian, my concern should be to love my neighbor as myself. My concern will be to deny myself, take up my cross, and follow him. That's one aspect. The second aspect that I think you guys were bringing out in your book, because you kind of structured your book by creation, fall, redemption, new creation, which I might quibble with some of the labels, but it's still fine. It's fine. But is the fact that we live in the new creation. The new creation's already begun. I think it's critical to have not just an eschatological framework of where we're going in the New Jerusalem, but the fact that it's already begun in and through Christ. And therefore, Galatians 3:28 is a reality now. There's neither Jew nor Gentile, slave nor free, male nor female. We're all one in Christ Jesus. And that's something that I try to say that the church is supposed to work towards now. It's not something like, oh, that's the ideal we'll get to someday. It's like, no, we need to do the hard, dirty work of making that happen now. And I think that means then when we go to the polls, I need to vote for how can I do these things in the present. And the reality then becomes your voice and voices like yours and voices of other people of color becomes critical for people like me to listen to, because otherwise I don't, even though there's an issue, let alone, what the issue might be. So that's my sermonette for the day, if you want to comment on that.
I love it.
I reserve the right to have another sermon, by the way. All preachers, get more than one sermon in a day, but go ahead. I'm sorry.
I love it. I love, first of all, the framing of a vote being the pursuit of the common good. Right. And I think the eschatology or the end times theology that you just described, that the end has broken into the middle now, it totally changes our ethics, right? If you believe that it's all going to burn and nothing matters, then you get yours while you can. But if you believe that God is doing something here and now, then you desire to partner with God, even in the way that you vote. And that's why we pursue the common good. So it's a vote is not simply an imposition of the will. It's not simply an expression of our preferences, but it is a expression of our commitment to the good of humanity, because Jesus loves the whole thing, right? Yeah, so I love what you said.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
I think you can add, it's unique to us in the sense that it's our responsibility to take care of our situation and be obedient to Christ in our context. But this is not a new phenomena. You go, 1 Corinthians 11, rich and poor around the Lord's table. We've been Jew and Gentile, and Galatians 2 and Ephesians
Acts
3.
chapter 6, the Hellenistic widows being neglected.
This has always been an issue, but the New Testament story is it's always been challenged. It's been the church that said, this is not right. We have to learn, we have to live differently now that we are in our citizens of God's kingdom and followers of Jesus. We have to, and I think that's what's important for all of us to keep framing these discussions. And we're going to come down to different places on some of the fine points of it. But the quest of saying that our motivation is we are kingdom people in the now, in our context, and we are required above all else to make that the way that we approach these things. And that's it's challenging. That's why we have these conversations.
Yeah, it's challenging. It really is challenging.
So this brings us to what you guys call the voices of color thesis.
Okay.
And I want you to explain what that is. You say on page 106, at the end of the day, if readers are still looking for a litany of phenomena to convince them about the ordinariness of racism in the United States and in their churches, they have not listened to the cries of those who've experienced racism. So what is the voice of color thesis, and elaborate on that for us?
Sure. So definitionally, voice of color thesis is simply the idea that people of color are uniquely qualified to speak about our experience of racism.
Okay.
So when someone says to me, it can't be that bad, or it's just a bunch of hurt feelings, right?
Wow.
That's a way of saying, well, you don't really know reality. So the voice of color thesis is an affirmation that there are tons of communities who know exactly what they've gone through and what they've survived. So in this way, this is personally what compels me the most about critical race theory is that the theorists, the scholars, are drawing from real stories of real communities throughout time of people who've survived. And in many cases, these are believing communities who've clung to Jesus in the midst of adversity, and their stories make up this vision of justice that critical race theorists are working with. Now, very few critical race theorists are Christian. I think that's actually growing quite a bit. But this voice of color thesis just says that those communities know what they're talking about, and to invalidate them is it's a choice.
Let me give an example of how I experienced that, if I could.
Mm.
And one of the founders of the Justice Conference back in the day is a personal friend, and he invited me to go to the one that was held in Chicago in 2017. So it's in June of 2017. We're 6 months into Trump's first presidency. And by the way, I want to make this comment not about the politics of the candidate. I'm reporting on the experience I had at that conference.
Mm-hmm.
About 95% of the speakers for those 2 days were people of color. There were some Indigenous Americans. There were African Americans. There were Latino speakers. So it was people of color were like 95%, and I would say of those, a good 95% would self-identify theologically as evangelical Christians.
Mm-hmm.
And I sat there for 2 days and listened to the heartache of those people. Excuse me, I get emotional thinking about it.
Yeah,
the heartache of those people who felt like, or were in the moment experienced a sense of abandonment by white evangelicals in the moment. And it blew me away. It was very humbling, and it was good for me to sit there as a white evangelical pastor to sit and just listen to their stories, to their perspective. I learned so much in those 2 days, but it's exactly what you're talking about. It was like, we just want to be heard and understand where this is coming from.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. I appreciate that, because it's not often the case that we meet with that kind of a listening ear that responds to us with the heart. I think because the stories we tell are so disruptive of the idea that we live in an equal society and that our laws are adequate to pursue the kind of Christian vision that we have. Because questioning that is so difficult for folks. It's just so rare that people respond favorably to the stories of pain that communities of color tell. So thank you.
Let me jump and ask one, just to make sure to balance this out a little bit. What aspects of CRT do you think we should be wary of? I know that, for instance, when I was living in the LA area, I was on the volunteer leadership team for International Justice Mission for a few years. And I was involved in a book club there where we read Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Antiracist. And we had a book discussion on it. We were all, there was a couple of people of color in the group, and most of us were white. But it was a fascinating book. But I came away from it wondering if part of the problem seems to me that he, anyway, makes everything about race. So, and I think sometimes that's what people sort of react to. So are there no other factors? Is this it? I'm a white person, therefore I'm the bad guy. So can you talk a little about that? And even, are there other, besides my reaction to that, I thought reading the book was challenging and important for me to read, but those are the kind of feelings you go through. And secondly, are there things about CRT we should be wary of?
Okay. Yeah, great questions, fair questions, and ones that we've had to field before. So if your viewers are feeling like this just makes everything about race, you're in good company. A lot of people feel that way. CRT is a tool. It's a tool of analysis, and it says we're going to look at race because race is not typically looked at. So it is a corrective lens that you're not going to wear all the time. You're going to wear it. You're going to wear it in order to scrutinize particular phenomena. Then you're going to take it off. There are other lenses too, right? We have to talk about gender. We have to talk about class. We have to talk about theology. There's so many different vectors that we need to be looking down. So just on the Marxist thing that we've kind of raised a few times here. Critical race theory, in some sense, is a correction to Marxism. Marxism is an economic analysis, right? It's just like looking at how power and money flow. And critical race theory said, you've forgotten something. I mean, as you followed the money, you forgot to look at race. So in some sense, it's a critic of Marx. So does it make everything about race? Yeah, because that's the kind of analytic that it's meant to be. So you don't wear those lenses all the time, right? So when you do that, you should become really wary. I think one of the overextensions that I'm concerned about, folks can begin to make predictions or prognosticate about the future. And one of the founders of CRT, Derek Bell, Harvard law professor, I like him very much, but he wrote something about his view of the future, which is very bleak. And I don't necessarily think he's wrong, but I just don't think he's right because I'm a Christian. And he is too. But what he wrote was that, people of color, and particularly he's writing for Black Americans, that we need to prepare for a really, really long night of permanent subordinate status. Permanent subordinate status. That forever in the American imagination, Black Americans and people of color are going to have lower status in the country. And I think that kind of lens, his intention there is really good. He's like, if you believe in the lie, and he's writing in the 70s, 80s, if you believe in the lie that the law will make you equal, you're going to be, not only will you be disappointed, but you will accrue negative effects to yourself by believing that lie. So what he advocated for was significant legal reform, which folks have been at work doing for a long time. So, but I think to cast that into the future so starkly is a prediction that I'm a little bit wary of. So the bleakness of what some critical race theorists kind of seem to display, what it really rubs against is eschatology. It's the hope of Jesus Christ who's broken into this world and has a very different story to tell about how the world will end with the return of justice because of the return of the King. So it's just a totally different story that I think makes us need to look critically at something like CRT.
Okay, interesting. Do you think that, and I'm asking you kind of to think maybe as from the white man's perspective a little bit here, because do you think that the resistance to CRT is motivated by the desire to not, or the lack of willingness to surrender power?
That's a great question. And I have not dared to think through that.
Okay. You don't have to dare to answer it either if you don't want either.
Yeah.
I'll answer it and tell you what I think, but well, go ahead.
That would actually be very valuable to me. I have heard people say that we don't want to give up power, but sometimes I feel like, especially in terms of the church, I know plenty of folks who really dislike what we've written here, who are incredibly generous and kind. I would never discount that, right? I've experienced their kindness. Some of them support our ministry. Some of them stop supporting our ministry. But I know folks to be really well-intended, and I want to keep saying that because I believe that the people of God are on a journey of redemption, and they may get some things right and some things wrong, because I know I do. So if I prematurely concluded that they're clutching power, that would be a mistake that makes it difficult for me to reach them. But I do know that can happen because I've done it.
Okay, yeah, I would put it in maybe rephrase the question, which you don't have to answer, in the context of those who are in the power to make the difference, those who are in the legislative power, they're the ones, right? I think that's really what the question focuses on, because it's not the average white person doesn't. Ultimately, let's be honest here. We say it's a democracy, but it's maybe in some aspects as well. Let me ask the question another way, and I'll give you my answer in just a second. What were some of the reasons why those people rejected or didn't like your book then?
Oh, yeah. Primarily ideological. Okay. So, it challenges their narrative, the gospel.
Okay.
It goes right to the core of their spirituality. That's my experience of their objections, right? So some of the scholars will deal with that write negative or critical reviews of the book. They'll deal with kind of like the peripheral aspects, but they, by and large, accept the premises about inequality, et cetera. But when a kitchen table level conversation is happening and someone's just really fired up about it, it strikes a nerve because they're understanding the gospel. They've been taught all this time to be colorblind.
You have a great chapter on that, or section on that, by the way.
No, thank you. The ideology and the worldview around colorblindness is part and parcel of the way that the Constitution and jurisprudence and legislation. That's how these things work. We're not supposed to look at differences either in the church or in legislation. And CRT says, and I think the scriptures say, no, we
Okay.
do take a fine-tooth comb and a very zoomed-in lens in order to understand exactly what's going on so we can reach the one. Yeah.
Actually makes sense, though, that why we would do that, because
Yeah.
it's there, so we can't ignore it. I mean, how can we do justice? Okay. My answer, by the way, was I think that there is an element of power and power dynamics involved. The way I always frame it, and I won't get into a long exegesis right now, is I think the parable of the sower is like the critical text of the New Testament. And why did two of the three soils that produce the plant don't produce fruit? Because the thorns and the stones prohibit it from doing so. And I think the good soil, by the way, had thorns and had stones. It bore fruit anyways. But the thorns are the comforts, the worries of life, the power or pleasure. And they simply thought, oh, I'm ready to follow you, Jesus, but I didn't know I had to go sell all my possessions and give to the poor and then follow you. I thought I could just follow you. And that lack of willing to sacrifice comfort, security, and security, I think, is an important word. Security, things that I have to surrender. What does it mean if I let this person have equal rights? What does it mean? What does it mean, for example, if we say we're going to let a certain number of people of color into Harvard, even if they don't have the same credentials as white students? What does that mean for us? And as an anecdote, I've filled out a lot of job applications for colleges and universities. I got a PhD in biblical studies, and consistently the application will say, by the way, we are looking for diversity, whatever, something along those lines. And I'll think, well, I probably ain't going to get the job because I don't have that. And I thought to myself, it's only fair, because for all these years, people of color, I got privileges and I got jobs that they couldn't have. And now we're making it more inclusive to give them opportunities. I just thought it just seems fair, even though I'm the one that suffers as a result of it. But
yeah, so that's so interesting because when I was at Michigan when one of the big affirmative action cases came out of the Supreme Court, and I was reading the rationale. And in hindsight, as I think through the affirmative action rationale, both then and now in the case that overturned affirmative action, the legal justification, this is where I'm using my CRT and legal studies lens, the legal justification still operates on colorblindness. The rationale was it can be in the university's interest to create a certain kind of learning environment. It had nothing to do with the original intentions of affirmative action, which you talk about, which is the intention of leveling the playing field a little bit. Right. It had everything to do back then, in the early 2000s, about the legitimate ends of a university. So even in our legal rationale then and now, we tend to be deliberately colorblind in our thinking.
Along with what you're saying too, Rob, there was a phrase I heard a number of years ago, and for the life of me, I can't remember the original attribution, but it was basically that when you've been in a place of privilege or power, equality begins to feel like oppression. And that struck me, because if you've been in that place and then all of a sudden things, it's exactly what you just said, Rob. There was a time when I would have been at the front of the line to get this job. Well, now I'm not there any longer. And so it feels like I'm being oppressed a little bit.
Yeah, right.
So the move toward equality for people who've been in power can feel very oppressive, because there's that you're beginning to feel a little bit of the marginalization that others have felt, because your status is not as protected as it once was.
Yeah.
And I think emotionally and psychologically that hits people. They know that they're feeling like they're not being treated fairly. And to move from that to where you were, Rod, it's only fair now, because in the past I was privileged and these people were not. Most people don't make that jump. They're living in the space of I'm the one that's now being, and then of course, then you politicize that, and then of course, as we do in our discourse, and then you go after all of that segment of the population because you're the one, you're being treated X, Y, or Z now, et cetera. So it's an interesting, both psychological and political phenomena that we have.
Yeah, Danny, that actually kind of knocks something loose for me here. I have been listening carefully to some of the folks in one of the church communities that we have been around. One of the phenomena that I've seen is that as the church began to emphasize the inclusion of people of color and the celebration of different cultures and the pursuit of, the demographically diverse neighborhood that the church is a part of, I heard on more than one occasion, white men in particular say, I just feel like I no longer have anything to offer here.
Yep.
Wow.
And that's absolutely not true, but I want to take seriously the feeling, like they're
Sure.
reporting an experience to me. So I don't know exactly what's behind that, but maybe it's the feeling like if we're talking about them, we're not talking about me. It could be that. So the phenomena that you're describing kind of maybe resonate with some of the experiences that
I think there was a default assumption of access to those things that are now being challenged, and so that just feels differently. And to be able to empathetically make the adjustment to say, okay, this is how everyone else used to feel. Let's work this out. It's real. That's a big jump, and most people don't think at that level. They react at the more visceral level of their experience, and it may even play out in, as I've heard other people say, I can't find a job. I'm poor. I mean, there's a growing poor white class now, and so there's all these other people. Then, well, the whataboutism goes back and forth pretty quickly at that because people are dealing, I think, with the psychology of these feelings.
Yes, the psychology of those feelings, the scarcity mentality, the idea that there's not enough pie to go around, which ironically, folks who believe in wealth creation also believe that the pie is too small. I don't think you can have both ways. So those are the phenomena that they're troubling. They're problematic, and we need to take them seriously.
Yeah.
This goes back though, Danny, to what we were talking about, Jeff, and we've done a couple live streams on the economic injustice that exists in the housing discrimination, and resultant with that is the educational discrimination and the disparity in education that these young kids, they don't have the same opportunities. They don't have the same chances to get to achieve anything is beyond what I had to achieve because it was a lot easier for me. I remember, as an anecdote, I did a lot of work in Bakersfield, California when I was pastoring there, and with some of the African-American pastors in town. And there's a couple Latinos, but mostly African-Americans. And me and one other pastor were both white. Both the Presbyterian pastors were both white. And, we both had our PhDs. And we were, we don't walk around saying, call me Dr. Rob. My name's Rob. But then the African-American pastors were Dr. So-and-so, Dr. So-and-so. And I remember thinking, and I'm sure he was thinking this too, thinking, well, gosh, that's a little arrogant. You're supposed to have a little bit of humility. And then I came to realize that for an African-American to accomplish something, to get a doctorate degree was an achievement that the whole community became proud of.
Exactly.
Because you rose to something that many others have not been able to rise to. It wasn't about honor. It was about achieving something through the ashes of their community. I'm like, oh, good thing I didn't open my mouth, by the way, and say something to them and chide them for calling themselves doctor or whatever. But hey, you close your book with this statement that just struck me hard. It says, with all that said, who knows whether or how long my family and I will be able to endure the rough seas of our racial fractious moment. We covet the warmth and friendship of our beloved community and the prayers of those who keep their eyes fixed on the eschatological horizon, a promise of entering the real presence of the resurrected Lord of the Sabbath. We can scarcely lift our heads. And then you add a number of pages later on. I'm not sure if this was you or Robert that wrote these pages there, but he says, to the leadership of predominantly white churches and denominations, Christian colleges and seminaries, parachurch ministries, and nonprofits, we pray that you will listen to the prophetic voices that remain and feel the pain of those who have paid a high cost to speak up.
Amen.
Wow. Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah. So those are lines from me and Robert, respectively.
Okay, good.
What I would say, just to amplify that, is we're still around, many of us, and we're taking battle damage as time goes on. Yeah. So don't be surprised when some of us kind of disappear. Yeah. Some of us quietly, some of us loudly, right? Yeah. But there, I think, will always be folks that stay, and that's an opportunity to listen and learn. Yeah. I think for leaders, especially, what I have seen is a kind of cosmic shrug. In many leadership rooms and conversations, I've watched godly people just say, like, we're not sure what to do on this. And for me, I'm like, that's a perfect admission that you have the opportunity to listen and learn from people who have survived it.
Right.
who
Right.
survived it and thrived despite it, and to take on their concerns. So I get that you don't know what to do, but other people do know what to do, and you have the opportunity to let them lead
That's a
and to
great point.
follow.
It's a great
So I would
point.
love to see that. I really would.
Wow.
Wow.
All right, Danny, anything you have to close?
No,
Or
just incredibly grateful for the conversation, Jeff.
absolutely.
And it's I think Rob and I, like I said, we want people to think and consider these. It's been a lifelong journey for me. I'm a native Southerner. I grew up in the suburbs of Atlanta during the civil rights era. And on other episodes, I've talked more about that, where I personally was involved in the desegregation of two churches. And, just that's been in my sort of DNA from my childhood. And this has been a lifelong journey of just processing this. And what I keep learning. And that's I love these conversations. So I thank you for your honesty and openness. And I hope our audience will take seriously what Jeff just said. This is an enormous weight for people like Jeff to carry, to have to be the prophetic voices in these spaces. So thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate your hospitality,
Absolutely.
for the chance to talk about it, for all your viewers and listeners who are taking it seriously. Really, thank you.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I want to express my own sorrow for my own complicity,
Yeah.
whatever that might be.
for sure.
Part of largely ignorance, I'm sure, for many, many years. I didn't speak up because I didn't know, and I should have known. I've been in leadership, pastoral ministry, and whatever for many, many years. So my apologies to you, and
Amen.
my encouragement to you that Danny and I and we will do what we can to be a voice. So
I received that, and all of us have so many different areas of diversity to learn and grow in, and we all owe apologies to others. And your willingness
true.
to offer that here and encourages me to do that elsewhere. So thank you.
Oh, great. You're very gracious. So thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it. Danny, thanks. We'll be back next week with another one, maybe wrapping up this before we get to the end of the world. I mean, to the election day in a couple weeks.
Yeah.